A TikToker thought she could get a laugh by pranking a royal guard, but what happened next left her shocked and humiliated. Stick around to see why messing with the wrong person can cost you more than just a prank. This is one moment you won't believe until you see it. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that'll stay with you long after they're told. The crowd at Buckingham Palace was growing larger, a sea of people all vying for the perfect view of the changing of the guard ceremony. Phones were raised everywhere, capturing every moment, every movement, every soldier in formation. Among the tourists stood Sophie, her phone in hand, her finger hovering over the record button, her eyes scanning the scene for someone, to make her next viral video. Sophie was no stranger to controversy. She had built her social media empire on one thing: pushing boundaries. Her TikTok account was filled with pranks, jokes, and moments meant to shock and amuse. The more outrageous, the better. And today, standing in front of the crowd, she saw an opportunity to boost her already massive following. Darren, the black royal guard standing perfectly still at his post, was her target. She knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't care about tradition, respect, or the history behind this moment. What mattered to Sophie was getting likes, shares, and reactions. And Darren, standing there unflinching, was the perfect setup. She stepped toward the front of the crowd, her eyes locking onto him with a mischievous glint. With a broad smile, she raised her phone, starting her live stream for her followers. "Hey everyone," Sophie said brightly, waving to the camera. "Check this out. I've found the most serious guy in all of London." Darren stood at attention, unwavering, his gaze straight ahead, his breathing steady. He had seen this before. Tourists trying to provoke a reaction, a comment here, a joke there. But he remained motionless. His training had taught him that he was not there for entertainment. He was there to serve, to uphold tradition, no matter how much the outside world wanted to make him a joke. Sophie took a step closer, getting right up to the barrier. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her now, could sense that this was her moment to shine. "Hey, Blackguard," she called, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Can you smile for the camera? Come on, it's just for the tourists. Smile!" Some of the people around her chuckled, and Sophie's smile grew wider. She could already hear her followers laughing in the background of her stream. But Darren didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. Sophie, growing increasingly bold, took another step forward, pushing her boundaries further. "No, not gonna smile. You're way too serious. It's just for the tourists," she teased again. Her voice carried, and a few people in the crowd laughed along. But Darren kept his posture perfect, as if he had heard nothing at all. Sophie's followers were sending her messages now, urging her to do more, egging her on. "You gotta get him to move, Sophie," one comment said. "Make him laugh. Make him crack." Sophie read it aloud to her followers with a wicked grin. She knew exactly what they wanted. "So serious. I bet this guy hasn't smiled since he got the job," she mocked, her words dripping with disdain. "Hey, Blackguard, can you show us a little personality, maybe a smile, or are you too busy pretending to be something you're not?" She raised her phone higher, zooming in on Darren's face. The more the crowd laughed, the more Sophie was determined to push, to get the ultimate reaction. The seconds stretched, and Darren stood still, his thoughts a blur behind his calm exterior. He could hear the laughter, the teasing, but he refused to acknowledge it. He had spent years perfecting the art of ignoring distractions, of staying still in the face of ridicule. This was just another tourist trying to get attention. This wasn't new. But Sophie wasn't done yet. Her voice grew louder, her tone more venomous. "What are you so proud of, huh? You're just standing there playing dress-up. You don't belong in that uniform. I mean, look at you. You're barely a real guard. You're just here for the tourists, aren't you?" The words stung. They always did. But Darren had learned how to compartmentalize. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythm of the ceremony around him. Breathe in, breathe out. It was the only thing that kept him grounded. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Sophie's eyes narrowed, her phone still rolling. Her followers were waiting, urging her on. And the crowd was growing more animated. Some tourists were pointing, laughing, even egging her on further. It was all too easy to see how this was playing out in her mind. A viral video, hundreds of thousands of likes, maybe even an interview on some morning talk show. Sophie, emboldened by the attention, continued her taunts. Can't even talk, huh? How much are they paying you to stand there like a mannequin? Bet you don't even understand what I'm saying? Her voice dripped with mockery. You don't even speak English, do you? Or do you just understand the orders they gave you to stand there and look impressive for the tourists? The crowd around her had grown quieter now. Some of them were visibly uncomfortable, exchanging glances. But Sophie didn't notice. She was too caught up in the performance. But then, something changed. The taunts, the insults, they were beginning to pile up. And Darren, for the first time that day, felt something inside him shift. Sophie was no longer just a tourist trying to get a laugh. She was questioning his very right to be there, his identity, his purpose. And it wasn't the first time he'd felt that sting, but today it felt different. Sophie, seeing that Darren still wasn't reacting, let out a dramatic sigh. Wow, I guess I have to poke you with a stick to get a reaction, she said, her voice filled with mock disappointment. Anyone got a stick? Maybe we can get him to move. What do you think? She laughed loudly, turning to the crowd for support. Some people laughed. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension building. But Darren's mind was racing. It wasn't just the insults that were bothering him anymore. It was the disrespect. He had faced this for years, learned to deal with it, but this was something different. This woman wasn't just mocking his duty. She was belittling his entire existence, as if his role in the world didn't matter, as if he didn't deserve the respect he had earned. He felt his hands tightening around the rifle at his side, the cool steel of the bayonet pressing against his gloved fingers. He was on the edge now, teetering between his years of training and something far more primal, a need to fight back. The words kept coming, louder, harsher, more demeaning. Sophie had crossed a line and Darren felt the last bit of his control slip away. Just as she said, "Let's see if we poke him with a stick," Darren turned his head slightly. His eyes, though still unwavering, were filled with something new, a fire that hadn't been there before. For the first time in his life as a god, Darren felt a spark of something that demanded to be heard. Sophie could feel the tension growing in the air, and she loved every second of it. Her followers were glued to their screens, urging her to push further, egging her on. The more Darren ignored her, the more determined she became to break his resolve, to turn the crowd into a chorus of laughter at his expense. But now, the taunts weren't just about his role as a guard. They were personal, and she could feel the shift in the crowd as they sensed the change too. Sophie, sensing her chance to push even further, took another step toward the barrier. Her phone's camera zoomed in on Darren's face, and she called out with deliberate malice, her voice sharper than before. "What's a black guy like you doing here?" she sneered, her words carrying clearly through the growing crowd. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else? Maybe in a different job? This uniform's just for the real Brits, right?" The crowd, unsure of what to make of the tension building between Sophie and Darren, paused. Some people laughed nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably. But Sophie wasn't listening to the uneasy murmurs around her. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back now. Darren's face remained still, his eyes fixed ahead, but inside, a wave of anger began to rise. He had heard racially charged comments before, had lived through them his entire life. From subtle microaggressions to more overt insults, he had learned to keep his cool, to stay in control. But this time, it wasn't just some random comment thrown his way. This was Sophie deliberately targeting his identity. She wasn't just mocking the uniform or the tradition. She was questioning his right to exist in this space, to wear the very uniform that he had earned through years of dedication. The sting of her words cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced on duty. It wasn't just about being a guard anymore. It was about being a black man standing in a space where he had to prove his worth every single day, even when the world around him tried to undermine him. But the worst part, the crowd around her was laughing. Not just a few chuckles, but a full, raucous laughter that seemed to feed off her cruelty. Sophie's words echoed through the crowd like a wave of discomfort, and Darren could feel his pulse quicken. He had seen it all before, people laughing at the guards, poking fun at the stoic faces, making jokes at their expense. But something about this felt different. It wasn't just a joke. It was a deliberate, targeted attack, and it was happening now, in front of hundreds of strangers, in a place he had spent years respecting and protecting. Sophie, sensing that she was getting a rise out of the crowd, pushed even further. Her voice grew louder, more venomous. "What's the matter, blackguard? You don't belong here, do you? You're just a stand-in for the real thing. How can a guy like you even wear that uniform? You're just here to stand in front of the tourists, look impressive and intimidating." A few of the nearby tourists laughed nervously, but a couple of others began to speak up, muttering under their breath, "Hey, that's a bit much." But Sophie did notice. The anger in her voice was clear. She wasn't just mocking his position. She was mocking his very existence, his right to be there. The worst part was that the crowd seemed to pick up on it. Some of them were laughing, some were uncomfortable, and a few started to egg her on. "Yow, tell him to move," one shouted. "He's a fake guard anyway," another chimed in. Darren's jaw clenched. His grip on his rifle tightened. He had stayed silent for so long, but now it was impossible to ignore. He had always kept his cool, remained still, but the weight of the mockery, the racial taunts, and the laughter stung in a way he couldn't suppress. His breathing, once steady, now felt heavier, as if the weight of the uniform was pulling him down, too heavy for even his shoulders to bear. Sophie's words continued to lash out, the venom behind them cutting deep. She was relentless now, pushing the boundaries of decency and respect. "You don't even know what it's like to be British, do you?" she sneered, looking him up and down. "You don't belong in that uniform. You should be in some other job. The real guards wear that with pride. You're just a joke to them." At this, the crowd began to grow more restless. A few people were uncomfortable, clearly uneasy about the direction the situation was taking. They shifted on their feet, exchanged glances, and some tried to move away from the growing spectacle. But Sophie, sensing that she was getting exactly the reaction she wanted, pressed harder. The crowd, now caught between the tension of Darren's unwavering composure and Sophie's escalating attacks, was torn. Some of them were beginning to voice their disapproval, while others seemed to revel in the drama unfolding before them. A few shouted at Darren too, mocking him for not responding. "Just smile, mate, it's all a joke," one yelled. Another chimed in, "You're standing there for a reason, don't take yourself so seriously." But Darren didn't move. He couldn't. His training held him in place. He had been through too much to let a moment like this define him. And yet, the taunts continued to roll off Sophie's tongue, each word a calculated strike meant to chip away at his dignity. The situation was escalating beyond just Sophie's words. It was no longer about a prank. It was about something much deeper. The crowd, once filled with innocent curiosity, had turned into an audience for Sophie's cruelty, and the more they laughed, the more it seemed like they were complicit in her actions. Darren's breathing grew heavier, but his body remained still. The tightness in his chest was building, but he refused to show it. He had stood tall through worse before, but something about this moment felt different. Sophie wasn't just challenging his role as a royal guard. She was attacking his very identity, his existence in this space, in this tradition, as if he didn't deserve to be there. Darren felt the boiling anger in his chest begin to shift. It was no longer about staying still. It was about respect. It was about the silent promise he made to himself every day to never allow his dignity to be taken for granted, to never let anyone treat him as less than he was. And Sophie, with her taunts, had crossed that line. In the depths of his mind, a voice urged him to hold back, to stay calm, to keep his composure. But the words from Sophie, the laughter from the crowd, and the weight of everything he had endured throughout his life made it impossible to ignore. This was no longer a joke. This was something that needed to be stopped. This simmering tension was now a raging fire inside him, and he could feel it building, just waiting for the moment to break. The tension in the air was now palpable, and Sophie could feel it as she stood just a few inches away from Darren. Her followers were urging her on, laughing, pushing her to keep going, to get the ultimate reaction she had been waiting for. She was almost there. Just one more step, one more move, and the moment would be hers. She took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Darren's unmoving figure. This time, it wasn't just words. Sophie knew exactly how to push him, how to test his limits. She leaned in, grinning as she placed her hands on the steel barrier between them, just inches from where Darren stood, still as a statue. "Let's see if you move if I do this," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. She gave the barrier a light push, sending a small ripple through it. She was trying to provoke, trying to see if he would flinch, if he would break his composure. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The gentle push felt like an assault on Darren's patience. He could feel the heat of the crowd, the weight of the moment pressing on him. His pulse raced, and his grip tightened on his rifle. The voices around him blurred into the background, replaced by the pounding of his heart. He had been calm for so long, had endured countless insults, but this was different. He could feel his body tense, his muscles coiling like a spring. He had been holding back, forcing himself to stay still, stay silent. But Sophie had gone too far. The push, the personal comments, the insults about his very identity. It had all reached a boiling point. And then Sophie took it a step further. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped Darren across the face, the sound ringing out like a gunshot in the stillness of the moment. The crowd gasped in shock, and a hush fell over the scene. For the briefest of moments, the entire ceremony seemed to come to a standstill. The slap wasn't just a physical action. It was an assault on Darren's pride, his honor, and his sense of self. It was a direct challenge to everything he stood for. Darren's body went rigid, his eyes flashing with an intensity that had been building for so long. His breath caught in his chest, but he didn't move. His gaze was locked on Sophie, who stood there, her face twisted in amusement, clearly thinking she had won. The crowd, still in disbelief, began to murmur, unsure of how to react. But then, in a single fluid motion, Darren responded. With the precision he had been trained for, he grabbed Sophie's wrist, his grip firm and unyielding. In one swift motion, he yanked her toward him, her body coming off balance as she stumbled forward. Without hesitation, he moved her to the ground, his strength catching her completely off guard. Sophie let out a surprised yelp, her phone clattering to the ground as she tried to break free. But Darren held her firmly, not with violence, but with authority, the kind of authority that came with years of discipline. He wasn't looking to hurt her. He was simply asserting his right to not be disrespected, to stand his ground when it mattered. The crowd was silent now. No one moved. It was as if time had frozen. Some people had taken their phones out, recording the unfolding scene, while others stood frozen in disbelief. This was no longer a prank, no longer just an online stunt. It was real, raw, and unsettling. Darren's voice, low and commanding, broke the silence. "Stay away from me. Do not touch me again," he said, his words calm but filled with an authority that sent a ripple through the crowd. He was no longer just a royal guard in uniform. He was a man standing up for his dignity, his pride, his right to exist without being mocked or belittled. As he spoke, a few people began to murmur in support. "She's slapped him," one voice said, clearly shocked by the audacity of Sophie's actions. "He's just doing his job," others whispered among themselves, unsure of what to think. The video of the incident was already spreading, and Sophie's laughter from moments ago had quickly faded into the background. Now her face was one of confusion and fear, as she realized the gravity of what had just happened. Sophie tried to pull away, but Darren held firm. His grip was still strong, but not excessive. He wasn't looking to hurt her. He was showing the crowd that some things couldn't be ignored, that there were boundaries, and when they were crossed, there were consequences. This wasn't just about standing still anymore. This was about respect, for his job, for his identity, and for the people who deserved it. And then, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Security and police officers, alerted by the escalating situation, were moving swiftly toward the scene. The tension in the air thickened as they arrived, their eyes scanning the crowd for signs of further disturbance. "Sir, step back," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. The officer looked at Darren, then to Sophie, who was now on the ground, scrambling to get her phone and her composure back. Darren released her, stepping back slightly but keeping his eyes on her, making sure she understood that this was not over. He was still a royal guard, still standing at his post, still deserving of the respect that his position commanded. Sophie, her face flushed with embarrassment, scrambled to her feet. Her once confident demeanor had disappeared, replaced by a mixture of fear and frustration. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. The police officer, seeing the situation for what it was, turned to Sophie. "You need to leave. Now," he said, his tone no nonsense. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but the officer's stern gaze silenced her. She tried to salvage her reputation, but the damage had already been done. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were watching, judging, recording. As she walked away, Darren stood tall, his body still rigid. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with the aftermath of the confrontation. The situation had escalated quickly, and he knew the consequences would be far-reaching. The murmurs from the crowd continued, the phones still filming, but Darren didn't care. He had made his point. He had stood up for himself, for his identity, for his dignity. For once, he wasn't just the silent soldier. He was a man who had fought back against years of disrespect. The moment lingered in the air, charged with uncertainty. Darren's eyes remained fixed ahead, but in his mind, he could feel the weight of the world shifting. The crowd, once just a faceless mass, had become something else now. An audience, a reminder that this wasn't just about the ceremony anymore. This was about everything that had led up to it, the history, the traditions, and the endless battles fought in silence, never seen, never acknowledged. Until now. The incident at Buckingham Palace quickly became the talk of the day, spreading like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and viral videos. Darren, once an anonymous figure in his immaculate uniform, was now the center of a media storm. As he stood at his post, his eyes scanning the crowd, he could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him. Some people were offering quiet nods of support, while others whispered and pointed, their phones raised, capturing every movement. The air felt thick with judgment. A woman near the gates whispered to her friend, "Did you see that? He actually grabbed her." Another passerby muttered under his breath, "Cruelty is so much more mature than this, even the wings of the birds." But for every supportive glance, there were just as many hostile looks. Some people who had been cheering Sophie on just moments ago were now accusing Darren of overreacting. "He could have handled that better," one man said to his companion, his voice tinged with disapproval. "He's supposed to be professional. This is a god, not a thug." The media wasted no time in seizing on the viral incident, each outlet eager to frame the story in their own light. Headlines were quick to label the encounter with bold words. Royal Guard's response to TikTok prank stirs debate. A blackguard's breaking point, was he right to fight back? Royal Guard reacts to racist attack, hero or hothead? To some, Darren was a hero, a man standing up for his dignity, for respect, for the boundaries that had been violated. His defenders called him a symbol of restraint and strength, unwilling to bow to the toxic provocation of a social media influencer. His actions, they argued, were the necessary response to years of unchecked racial taunts and the ever-present question of his place in the ceremonial world of the British Royal Guard. To others, however, Darren was labeled a hothead, a guard who had lost his composure, who had let his emotions get the best of him. A Royal Guard should never react this way, one prominent news anchor commented. He's been trained to stand still no matter what. What happened to professionalism? What happened to self-discipline? But there were also voices framing Darren as the victim. He had endured years of insults and racial mockery, and on that day he had finally snapped. Can you blame him? One social commentator said, their voice sympathetic. How many times has he been subjected to humiliation just for doing his job? His actions were the breaking point of years of built-up frustration. And then, there were those who focused on Sophie, the influencer who had started it all. Her supporters argued that her actions were just an innocent prank, a bit of fun in the middle of a busy tourist attraction. She was just playing around, some said. It's not like she physically attacked him. She didn't deserve that response. But those voices were drowned out by the growing chorus of condemnation from those who recognized the deeper issues at play: racism, disrespect, and the abuse of social media for viral stunts at others' expense. Darren's face, once unseen by millions, was now plastered all over screens and news sites. He was no longer just a royal guard. He had become an unwitting symbol of racial tensions, professional conduct, and the consequences of the world's growing culture of online harassment. His emotions, now laid bare for all to see, were a reflection of a much deeper societal issue that many were only beginning to understand. As the days passed, the fallout from the incident grew more intense. Darren found himself pulled from duty. The Royal Guard's internal review process began immediately with an investigation into his actions. He was placed on suspension pending a full inquiry, and his once unquestioned role as a defender of the Queen's residence now seemed uncertain. Darren's phone was flooded with messages, texts from friends, family, and even some strangers who had seen the incident. Some were supportive, offering words of encouragement, reminding him that he had done what anyone in his position would have done. Others were harsh, telling him he had ruined his career, that he had acted impulsively and irreversibly damaged his reputation. The weight of it all settled on Darren's shoulders like a physical burden. He had stood tall for so long, but now, with his future uncertain, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, scrutinized, every action, every word, under a microscope. He spent long hours walking around London trying to make sense of it all. He'd been a royal guard for years. He had trained tirelessly, enduring the heat, the discomfort, the endless taunts, and the questions about his place in the uniform. But in the blink of an eye, everything had shifted, a slap, a moment of anger, and now, his identity was no longer his own. The world had taken it, framed it, and judged him for it. At night, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the events over and over, his own voice, calm yet authoritative, demanding Sophie stay away. Had he overstepped? Had he done the right thing? His thoughts were a jumbled mess, the weight of his position as a Black Royal Guard now heavier than ever before. He thought about the people who had supported him, but more so, he thought about the ones who hadn't, the ones who believed he should have endured the abuse silently, just as he had done so many times before. The very uniform that had once filled him with pride now seemed like a symbol of something he couldn't fully grasp. Was it just a symbol of tradition, or had it come to represent something more, something that, over time, had become restrictive, stifling, and detached from the realities of the world around him. In the solitude of his thoughts, Darren wrestled with his identity. He had spent years trying to prove himself worthy of wearing that uniform, trying to prove that a black man could stand among the elite without being diminished by his race. But now, the world seemed to be asking him the same question Sophie had posed. Do you really belong here? The investigation into his actions, the public backlash, the media coverage, it all felt like a weight he couldn't escape. And as much as he wanted to tell himself he had done the right thing, a quiet voice in the back of his mind wondered if he had just played into their hands. Had he given the world exactly what it wanted? The confrontation, the drama, the chaos. It was all there, on display for everyone to see. It wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about a system that had never truly accepted him, that had only ever tolerated his presence as long as he stayed silent. And now, Darren wondered, what do I do with the silence? But despite the pain, despite the uncertainty, Darren knew one thing for sure. His response had not been out of impulse alone. It had been the culmination of years of frustration, a deep-seated need to protect his dignity in a world that so often sought to undermine it. And as the days wore on, Darren began to understand something that had eluded him before. The world would continue to react, to judge, and to speculate. But he, too, had a role to play, a role that went beyond the uniform, beyond the headlines. His voice, his actions, his truth mattered. And though the investigation was still ongoing, Darren's journey toward understanding his true place in the world had only just begun. The days that followed the incident were a blur. Darren, once proud to stand at attention in his Royal Guard uniform, now found himself walking aimlessly around the palace grounds in civilian clothes. The uniform, which had once been a symbol of his pride and dedication, felt like a distant memory. It was as if, with one act of defiance, every hour spent training, every moment spent on duty, had suddenly been reduced to a single incident, an incident that now seemed to define him more than the years of quiet service that had come before it. Darren walked past the gates of Buckingham Palace, the noise of the busy streets just beyond the grounds fading as he ventured further into the quieter, more secluded parts of the palace courtyard. The heavy weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders, and with each step he felt as though he was walking further away from the man he had been, and closer to someone he couldn't quite recognize. The palace, with its centuries of tradition and grandeur, felt alien now. The sound of soldiers marching in formation, the music of the regimental band, the faces of tourists, all felt distant, disconnected. They were still part of the ceremony, still part of the history that Darren had sworn to uphold, yet for him, everything had changed. The weight of the uniform, the very thing that had once given him a sense of purpose, now felt oppressive. He had worn it with pride for so many years, believing that by doing so he was not only serving the monarchy, but also representing a deeper, more personal commitment to tradition. But now, as he walked among the statuesque buildings of Buckingham Palace, the significance of that uniform seemed less clear. It felt like a costume, a relic of a past that was not his own. The duty he had once felt so strongly had now become a burden, one that was impossible to ignore. Darren found a quiet bench near the fountain at the edge of the courtyard and sat down, his eyes tracing the water as it rippled in the breeze. He was trying to make sense of what had happened, of how everything had unraveled so quickly. His mind went to his family. He thought of his mother, his father, both of whom had taught him to stand tall, to honor his roots, to never let anyone define him. He thought of his community, the people who had looked up to him as a symbol of resilience, as someone who had defied the odds. But now, in this moment of reflection, it was hard not to wonder if he had let them down. Had he failed them? Had he failed himself? The pressure had always been there, the weight of expectations that came with being part of the Royal Guard. He had always been expected to uphold a standard of composure, to be above reproach, to embody the best of British tradition. But now, as he sat on the bench, the reality of it all hit him. The traditions, the duties. They had never fully accounted for the personal toll it took on his identity, his emotions, his dignity. He thought of the moment when Sophie had crossed the line, when she had pushed him too far. The slap that had shattered his composure had been the breaking point. But it wasn't just about the physical blow. It was about everything that had led up to it. The years of subtle slights, the racial taunts, the assumptions that came with being a black man in a role so deeply entrenched in British history. The uniform had once been a symbol of pride, but now it felt like a costume that no longer fit him. He was expected to be a symbol of stoic tradition, to take everything in stride, but what happened when tradition itself felt hollow? As he sat there, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Mind if I sit here?" Darren looked up to see Jasmine, a fellow officer in the Royal Guard, standing nearby with a warm smile. She had always been someone he respected, calm, collected, and fiercely intelligent. She had been through her own struggles, and Darren knew that she could relate to the pressure he was feeling now. "Jasmine," Darren said, his voice quiet, "I didn't think I'd see anyone else around here today." Jasmine chuckled softly as she sat down beside him, her posture relaxed, her expression sympathetic. "Well, the palace is still open to the public, even if we're not technically on duty," she said, settling into the bench next to him. For a moment, they both sat in silence, listening to the distant hum of the city, the occasional laughter of tourists, and the soft sound of the fountain's water. Jasmine seemed content to let him process everything in his own time. She had a way of giving people space when they needed it, something Darren had always admired about her. Finally, she spoke. "You want to talk about it?" Darren hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I don't know what to think anymore. I've been part of this for so long, Jasmine. The tradition, the uniform, it all meant something. But now, after everything that happened, I'm not so sure. I've been wondering if it's worth it. What does it really mean to wear this uniform? Is it just about tradition, or is it about something deeper?" Jasmine listened quietly, her expression understanding. She had seen the toll that this job took on others, had watched as they struggled with their own identity in the face of history, and now she could see that Darren was in the midst of that struggle. "I know what you mean," Jasmine said after a long pause. "I've asked myself those same questions. There are days when it feels like we're just actors in a play, following a script that doesn't reflect who we really are. But then there are other days when you realize that it's not just about the tradition. It's about what you bring to it. For me, it's always been about more than just standing still and looking pretty. It's about the values we represent, the way we honor the past, yes, but also the way we can make the future better." Darren turned his head slightly, considering her words. "But how can we make a difference when it feels like the system is built to keep us in place? I mean, I'm a black man standing here, Jasmine, and no matter how much I strive to be a part of this tradition, there are always those who will question whether I deserve to be here." Jasmine nodded, her eyes soft with empathy. "Trust me, I know. I've been through it. But you can't let their ignorance define you. You're not just standing here as a black royal guard, you're standing here as a man who has earned his place just like anyone else. You've fought for it, and you've earned the respect of those around you. What happened with Sophie, it wasn't about the uniform, it was about respect. And you've got to remember, respect isn't something that comes automatically. Sometimes you have to demand it." Darren let out a slow breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought back to that moment with Sophie, the words, the slap, the frustration. He had been so focused on trying to maintain his composure, trying to uphold the tradition, that he had forgotten about the most important part, his own dignity. "I've been so focused on playing the role that I forgot why I started this in the first place," Darren said softly. "It was never about being silent. It was about being proud of who I am, of the legacy I carry. I've got to stop thinking of this as just a job and start thinking of it as a responsibility to myself, to my family, to my community. Jasmine smiled, her eyes bright with understanding. Exactly. You've got to own it, Darren. The uniform may be heavy, but you're the one who gives it weight. You're the one who decides what it means. Darren sat back against the bench, feeling a shift inside him, the frustration, the anger, the doubts. They hadn't disappeared, but something had changed. Jasmine was right. The uniform wasn't just a symbol of tradition, it was a symbol of him, of his journey, of everything he had worked for. And while the world around him might judge him for his actions, he knew that only he could define who he was. "Thanks, Jasmine," he said quietly, a sense of clarity beginning to form. "I needed to hear that." "Anytime, Darren. You're stronger than you think. Just keep pushing forward." For the first time in days, Darren felt something he hadn't in a while. Hope. The weight of the past was still there, but now it was a weight he could carry. Days passed, and the weight of the incident with Sophie continued to linger, heavy in Darren's chest. Though the storm of media attention had started to die down, the consequences remained. The Royal Guard's internal review was thorough, as it had to be. Darren knew that his actions had been dramatic, and while he had defended his dignity, he couldn't escape the reality that he had broken the established rules, and that might cost him more than just a few days off duty. He spent those days in deep reflection, pacing his small apartment and replaying every moment of the confrontation. The questions never stopped. Did I handle it the right way? Could I have said something instead? Should I have walked away? But as much as he wrestled with his doubts, Darren realized something fundamental about himself. He couldn't allow this single moment to define the entirety of his journey. One afternoon, as Darren sat on his couch, staring at the quiet city outside his window, his phone rang. Pulling him from his thoughts, it was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering. "Sergeant Harrington?" a voice said on the other end. "Yes, this is Darren," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm calling from the office of Major Timothy Hall. We've completed the review of the incident last week." Darren's stomach sank. The moment of judgment had arrived. The voice continued. "We've considered all aspects of the situation. Your actions have been noted, and while there were concerns, we've decided that this is not a case for dismissal." Darren exhaled slowly, unable to believe the words he was hearing. "You will face a formal warning, and you'll be expected to undergo further sensitivity and protocol training to reinforce the standards of conduct expected from a Royal Guard." Darren's mind raced, and though he knew the road ahead would be different, he felt a small but significant wave of relief. The past few days had been a whirlwind of uncertainty, but this moment marked a turning point. The system wasn't giving up on him. It was giving him a chance to make it right, to prove that his role as a guard was not just about keeping his mouth shut and standing still. It was about standing tall, even when things weren't perfect. "The decision is final," the voice on the other end concluded. "We'll expect you to report for duty tomorrow. Thank you for your understanding, Sergeant Harrington." As Darren hung up, a mixture of relief and determination washed over him. He hadn't been fired. His reputation hadn't been completely destroyed. He was being given a second chance, not just to continue in his role, but to redefine it. Darren thought about what Jasmine had said to him just days earlier. "You have the power to define what the uniform means." Now, more than ever, Darren knew that he was ready to make that definition his own. The next morning, Darren stood in front of his mirror, carefully adjusting his uniform, the same uniform that had felt like a weight just days ago. The familiar red coat, the bearskin cap, the polished boots, they all still looked the same, but to Darren, they felt different now. He had changed, and so had his understanding of what it meant to wear this uniform. It wasn't just about tradition anymore. It was about what he could represent, how he could stand as more than just a guard in a royal ceremony. As he made his way to Buckingham Palace, Darren felt a quiet sense of resolve settle in. This time, when he walked through the gates, he wouldn't just be a soldier in the ceremonial ranks. He would be a symbol of something more, a man who had faced his own doubts, challenged expectations, and come out on the other side stronger for it. The moment he arrived at the palace, he was greeted by Major Hall, who nodded to him with an approving glance. The tension between them, which had once been so thick, seemed to have dissipated. Major Hall knew Darren had learned something from the experience, something deeper than any protocol could teach. "Good to have you back, Sergeant," Major Hall said, his voice low but genuine. "You've handled things better than most would have expected." Darren gave a brief nod, his voice steady. "Thank you, sir. I'm ready to serve." The day passed like any other, changing of the guard ceremony. Crowds gathered, tourists took their photos, and the guards moved in their perfect formations. But Darren moved through it all with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't there to just follow orders. He was there to serve with integrity. He was there to stand as a symbol of something larger than the pomp and circumstance of the ceremony: respect, duty, and progress. During a brief moment of rest, Darren found himself standing near the gates, scanning the crowd. As the tourists milled about, one family passed by, and Darren caught the eyes of a young boy, no older than 8 or 9. The child's face lit up as he stared at Darren in awe. "Wow," the boy said, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "Look at that guard. He looked so strong." Darren smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile this time. It wasn't for anyone else but the child, and himself. In that moment, he realized that the true legacy of his role wasn't in the silence, the stoic poses, or the perfection of his uniform. It was in how he carried himself, in what he represented. It was about standing strong for something more than just a job. He wasn't just wearing the uniform of the Royal Guard. He was wearing the mantle of something greater: change. The change that came when people like him took a stand. The change that started with one moment of defiance but continued with every act of dignity that followed. That night, Darren returned home, tired but satisfied. The storm was not over. It never would be. But he knew now, without a doubt, that his voice, his identity, and his actions were too important to let any moment define him negatively. He would carry them forward, just as he carried the uniform not as a symbol of past traditions, but as a representation of the future he was helping to shape. And in that future, he would stand proud, ready for whatever came next. The sun was beginning to set over Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the grand stone structure. The crowd was thinning as tourists filed out, some still snapping photos, others slowly retreating to the comfort of their hotels after a day of sightseeing. The changing of the guard ceremony had come to a close, and Darren stood once more at his post, fully uniformed and standing tall in front of the iconic gates. But something had changed. Darren felt a deeper connection to the uniform he wore today. It wasn't just about the tradition or the ceremony anymore. It was about who he was and what he stood for. He had spent years learning how to fit into this world, to play a role that was designed for someone else, for a different time. But now, he understood something more profound. He had the power to redefine what this role could mean. Not just through the uniform, not just through the traditions that had defined the Royal Guard for centuries, but through his actions, his integrity, and his kindness. As he stood in place, his posture once again flawless, Darren couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The doubts, the insecurities, the questions about whether he truly belonged in this role had faded, replaced by a quiet but powerful sense of purpose. He knew now that respect, true respect, was earned, not by keeping silent, not by standing still, but by being steadfast in your beliefs, by having the courage to stand up for what's right, and by embracing the responsibility that came with a uniform. The crowd had nearly dissipated, but one familiar face still remained. As Darren glanced to his side, he saw Jasmine standing guard nearby, her own posture as perfect as ever. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and a subtle smile passed between them. It was a small gesture, but one full of understanding. Jasmine had been there for him in his lowest moments, offering guidance when he needed it most. And now, they both stood in the same place, not just as guards, but as individuals who had reshaped what it meant to be part of this tradition. The Royal Guard was never meant to be static, to be a relic of the past. It was, in its truest form, a living institution, one that needed to evolve with the times, one that needed to reflect the diversity and the values of the society it served. Jasmine's smile said it all. They weren't just guardians of the monarchy, they were representatives of something greater, something more inclusive and just. As the last few tourists made their way out of the palace grounds, Darren stood there, reflecting on the many layers of his identity. His role as a guard was no longer just about protecting tradition. It was about embodying the best of it, and in doing so, paving the way for a future that included everyone. He understood now that the traditions, however ingrained, could always be challenged, always be reshaped by those who were willing to stand up, to speak out, and to act with integrity. The crowd that had once watched with curiosity, and in some cases mockery, was now a distant memory. What mattered now was how Darren chose to carry himself moving forward, not just as a soldier in the Royal Guard, but as a person who had earned his place, who had earned his voice. As the evening light faded, Darren felt a sense of peace settle over him. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. His identity, his values, and his actions spoke louder than any uniform ever could. He was more than just a symbol of tradition. He was a living embodiment of the change that was already happening. In that moment, he realized that respect wasn't just a value he upheld. It was a universal value that should be afforded to everyone, no matter their background. The respect Darren had earned was not given to him because of his position. It was given to him because of the strength of his character, the dignity with which he carried himself, and the unwavering belief that every person, no matter their race, their background, or their role, deserved to be treated with the same level of respect. Darren's journey had been long, filled with challenges and moments of doubt, but now, standing once again in his uniform, he felt an unwavering sense of pride in what he had accomplished, not just for himself, but for those who would follow in his footsteps. The past had shaped him, but it was his future that he was now ready to build, one step at a time. As the last of the visitors filed out of the palace gates, Darren stood tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was no longer just a guard. He was part of something greater, a symbol of change, of force for progress, and a reminder that traditions, no matter how deeply rooted, can always evolve when they are shaped by the right hands. And in that moment, Darren knew that he was not just standing guard over the palace, but over the values that made it a place worth protecting: respect, dignity, and the belief that anyone, regardless of their background, could be part of something meaningful. The ceremony may have ended for the day, but Darren's role, his journey, was just beginning.